So, as our world calendar changes and we move a little more deeply into the new year, we move also more deeply into the season of Epiphany. The new year can be a time for us to take stock, to look back perhaps and ask ourselves, from where have we come? And to look forward and say, to where are we going? What light guides us? Who are we following? And how are we leading? Our gospel reading is taken from John. Every year around this time, we read of the call of the disciples. This year it is John's version. And you have to remember the context. This is chapter 1 of John, and John starts his gospel with the words, "In the beginning was the Word." And later he'll say, "The Word was made flesh and dwelt among us." For this is the season of the incarnation. We have moved from Christmas, it is true, but we now live in the time of Epiphany. The light dwells with us. And that light shines forth, and we are called to seek it and see it and uncover it and be it for the world. Come and see. This is the invitation to Nathanael. But what is he called to come and see? That word dwell that John uses, in the Greek, the word dwell among us is literally something like erect or pitch a tent. Now that erecting a tent, that pitching a tent, should remind us that the glory of God dwelt among the people of Israel in the tent that was their first tabernacle. It traveled with them as they wandered. The glory of the Lord was in front of them and led them, but at times it protected them from behind. Now that tent later becomes the great temple. And now, according to John and the gospel writers, that temple is Jesus. The glory of the Lord shines forth in the person of Jesus in the flesh. Now that term glory is a little difficult for us to translate nowadays. It's that Hebrew Shekinah. Because when we hear it, we will probably sometimes at least hear something like heroism, like the glory of a soldier's victory. Or we might hear it in terms of something like great beauty, like the glory of the sunset or the glory of the wildflowers in the field. Or we might even hear it in context of like royalty, like the queen in all her glory. With the term glory there being some combination of like power and brilliant and radiant beauty. And I think it is all these things. But also we should hear it in terms of that kind of probably like the Jewish readers and Jewish hearers would have heard it in terms of presence. It's the way God shows up in the world. And the thing about God showing up in Jesus is that God sometimes shows up in terms of contradiction. So I think, when I say that, I think of this great woodcut that some of you may know. It's called Christ of the Breadlines. And I'm going to show it to you because I brought it. Okay, I'm going to put it up here by the altar. But it was done by Fritz Eichenberg. It's called Christ of the Breadlines. I know you can't see it. I'm going to describe it, but I'm going to put it up here so that when we go to communion, you can see it. It was first published in the newspaper that Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker put out. So there's a group of men who are homeless and stricken by deep poverty. They're bowed down by the weight of their troubles and by hunger. You see the view from the side, and they are all in line. And about in the middle of the line, about the fourth person, is Jesus in profile, and he glows with light. For the glory of the Lord is not in the war horse, as the psalmist says, but God shows up beside the wounded. So let us return to Nathanael. He follows Philip, and the gospel tells us that Jesus saw him coming. And he tells Nathanael, I saw you. I saw you under the fig tree. Nathanael comes to see Jesus, but Jesus has already seen him and already knows him. This message of seeing, that discipleship is about coming to see, following, yes, but also understanding more clearly, is a theme throughout the Gospels. In John, the next reading, right after this one, right after the chapter ends, is the wedding at Cana, where the disciples see there, they see a different possibility. They see this wedding feast in which wine does not run out, but gets better as the evening progresses. They see abundance where they might have seen poverty. But Jesus says, I saw you. What does that feel like, to really be seen? A couple of years ago, I took part in a fellowship that taught us to use contemplative techniques to help physicians and other healthcare providers become more aware of their own feelings during patient encounters. And by that awareness, there is this ability to recognize our own distractions and become more present to the person in front of us. And that awareness builds compassion. And I remember the first day. I remember when one of my colleagues who worked in the ICU began to talk of her own suffering and how she struggled with the constant death and suffering of patients on the ventilator due to COVID. And I remember how we all sat in silence. But it was that kind of reverential silence. We all knew what she was suffering, perhaps not in all its details, but we could understand. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, these people get it. They get me. As the fellowship went on, I began to understand why I felt such a connection to everyone in that fellowship, and why I felt that fellowship was so important to me. It was not only the techniques we learned, the pausing, the meditation, the setting of intentions before we went to the patient room. It was this community within which I felt I was seen and heard. One of the teachers told a story about going to a refugee camp to work with nurses and others who were treating refugees and people who were suffering from HIV and AIDS. The resources were very slim. The teacher said that in the end of his time there, he and a group of caregivers gathered together, and those caregivers expressed their profound gratefulness to him. And he said to them, but I feel like I have done nothing for you. You don't have the medicine you need. You don't have the beds. People are dying despite whatever we do. And they said to him, we are grateful because you have seen us. You have seen us and you have heard us. And we could speak our experience, an experience that no one else knows. It brings what is hidden into the light. And so, today is about calling. It is about following. But it's also about being seen. For when Jesus calls us, he first sees us. He sees our glory. He sees what is hidden and brings it to the light. For when we are called, that call strikes something mysterious and deep within us. We might have a hard time putting it into words or into some categories like pros and cons. What we feel is a love that heals us because it sees us in our suffering. And it is a healing. It is a healing that allows us to follow where Jesus is going. And it's that healing that gives us compassion. It's that healing that brings forth our light, our glory, our compassion, our energy, our love. And then it is our turn to go and give it to the world. Amen.